Okay, we are back. I am very happy to have back on the Goldstein on Gelt show Professor Walter Williams, who's an economist, a commentator, and he's a professor of economics at George Mason University. Professor, a real pleasure to have you back.
Oh, thanks.
So in light of kind of the difficult economic situation, regardless of what's going on in the stock market, there are a lot of people on the ground who are still having a tough time. Do you think maybe it's time to consider a minimum wage as an opportunity to help them out?
Well, all depends who you want to help out. The minimum wage law has the effect of discriminating against the employment of lower skilled people, and I think that many people support the minimum wage because they care about their fellow man and they want to make things better. But I think that you see the effect of the minimum wage law if you put yourself in the place of an employer. And if you ask the question, if I must pay, let's say in the case of the United States, the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. If I must pay $7.25 an hour to no matter which employee I hire, does it make sense for me to hire the employee who is so unfortunate so as to have skills that can only add $4 or $5 an hour to my operation? Well, most employers would view that as a losing economic proposition and not hire that person. And so that's what I mean when I say that the minimum wage law tends to discriminate against the least skilled people. And if you look at the labor force almost anywhere, including the United States, the least skilled people are teenagers, young people, and they have they lack the experience and maturity and other attributes of an adult. And if you look at the unemployment statistics, almost everywhere, you see that teenagers are the most unemployed, particularly during these hard times.
Okay, so I'm sympathetic to the teenagers, but let's look at a slightly different population. For example, women who could certainly benefit from an increase in salary a little bit. And I'm not talking about young women, but women who now are having to support oftentimes single-parent households. According to when President Obama made sort of an ambitious agenda to increase the minimum wage, he spoke about it as decreasing the inequality that has really become more rampant in the economy. Is he completely off base?
Well, I think so. That is, I think that having a job that pays, say, $7 an hour or $6 an hour is preferable to not having a job that pays $7 an hour or $9 an hour. That is, if you're earning $5 an hour, you can buy more food than if you're earning $0 an hour. And so it just, again, the intentions behind the minimum wage law are, for the most part, very noble, but the effects, I think, are bad. And matter of fact, sometimes the intentions aren't very good. That I wrote a book some years ago, and the title of it was South Africa's War Against Capitalism. And I did a study of South African labor markets. This was during the apartheid era. And the major supporters of minimum wages were white racist unions that would never have a black in a member. That is, the major supporters, they wanted minimum wage laws for blacks. They actually stated that we want minimum wage law for blacks. The reason why is that to get rid of their lower price competition. Mm-hmm. And then also in terms of raising the minimum wage or raising the cost of labor, well, entrepreneurs, they're not stupid. When you raise the cost of something, people try to find substitutes. And one way of finding substitutes is to automate, to send, to export jobs overseas to cheaper areas, and so the minimum wage law has a net effect of reducing employment opportunities.
Okay, so let me note you had actually told us part of that story in the last time you were on Goldstein on Gelt. For those people who missed the previous interview with Professor Williams, just go to goldsteinongelt.com and look that up, or go to YouTube because all of our interviews are put up there. I fully understand what you're saying, and I run a small business. My day job is that I'm an investment advisor, and I do the radio show once a week, so I get an opportunity to speak to interesting people, but I really don't like being told by the government who to hire and how much to pay, and it does certainly affect the way I would hire. But it seems that there's a lot of economists who are on the other side of the equation. There was sort of the famous study that was done by Alan Kruger when he looked at the minimum wage increases, and he said, listen, there was no evidence that they caused a fall in employment. And I mean, subsequent to his study, there have been many studies on this topic. Is it just a political issue? Because
the study to which you referred to is Card and Kruger, and that has been thoroughly discredited by the economics profession. That study, and many people just really promoted the study because they wanted to raise minimum wage laws, particularly labor unions. They were just so happy with this the study.
Have there not been subsequent studies as well? And I believe there was at the University of London and at
the only debate about the minimum wage law is the magnitude of the effect. That is, different economists will say, well, a 10% increase in minimum wage law will cause a 2% reduction in employment. Now, there are other studies that'll say it causes a 1% or 3%. It's just the primary debate is over the magnitude of the unemployment effects. So, and matter of fact, if you read any economics textbook, an introductory or intermediate textbook, they'll say that the minimum wage law reduces the employment for low-skilled people.
Okay. We are talking with Professor Walter Williams from George Mason University, who's an expert on many areas, but one of them is the question of whether governments should force companies to pay a minimum wage. One of the other arguments that people make is that if you don't have people working, they end up on unemployment and you're just giving them money. So at least by giving them a job at some level, it's more cost effective than just, putting people on the dole.
Well, I think that one you have to say, raising the wage, making a wage higher than the value of what person can produce will cause unemployment. If you look back, you sound like a much younger person I am. I'm 77 years old, but when I was a kid, when you pulled into a gasoline station, there was a kid or a young person to fill your tank with gas, wash your windows, and check the air or oil in your car. Now you see self-service stations. How can we explain that? Is it because Americans of the day like to smell gasoline fumes while they fill their cars up? Another example, when I was a younger person, you go into a movie theater. There were 2 or 3 ushers, young people, to show you to your seat. You don't find ushers in theaters today, and that's not because Americans of the day like to stumble down the aisle in the dark to find their seat. And so the minimum wage law has destroyed those kind of jobs. And you can see many other examples of self-serve or throwaway dishes because restaurants can't afford to hire people to wash dishes anymore, and so there are many examples of how people substitute capital for labor when the price of labor rises.
Mm-hmm. That is an interesting way to look at it. And how do you relate this to the immigration reform that the government is trying to do to allow more workers into the fray? Isn't that going to simply hurt the low-priced workers even more?
Well, of course they'll have to compete more, and I think one of the problems with low-wage workers, at least in the United States, I don't know about the situation in Israel, is that the welfare state or high unemployment compensation, it encourages people to remain unemployed for a longer period than they otherwise would be. In 1948, the duration of unemployment has doubled since 1948. That is, wow. People say, well, gee, they get a McDonald's job at $7 an hour. You say, well, I'm not going to take that job. I'll look around for something else because I'm getting unemployment compensation and it's not taxable.
Okay, so I hear that, but then there's the other side of the equation, which is the need to be humane. And let's just look to Europe, right? Greece had a huge amount of problems, and they're saying that there are families that are so poor that they have to put their children into orphanages because they can't afford to feed them.
Yeah.
Is,
Well, I would say the least humane thing to do is to have a set of circumstances in Greece that has created the 50% or more unemployment, particularly among us young people. That is to let the state of affairs get to a set of circumstances where you have so many people under hardship. It was not an act of God that delivered the conditions in Greece. It was an act of the parliament, the act of the people.
Mm-hmm. Okay, since we're moving to this side of the world anyway, let me ask you something about an article you wrote related to Egypt. In the article, you spoke about the way, or whether it's possible even for Egypt to achieve true democracy. What's your take on that now?
Well, I think that what people have to recognize is that the problems of many countries around the world, and most notably Egypt and other countries in the Middle East, is that the people do not have economic liberty. And it turns out that Egypt ranks very low in terms of economic liberty. And if you look at countries that are wealthy, where people do well, they have a large measure of economic liberty, and they have a high ranking on the index of economic freedom. Now, what needs to be done, I think, in Egypt is stop worrying about democracy and pay more attention to economic liberty, because if once you have economic liberty, then I think that it puts pressures on the political system to have democracy. We've seen it in Chile with the Pinochet regime. It was a coup, and they just forced economic liberty, and ultimately the people got political liberty. It's the same thing in Taiwan. There was economic liberty, and now there's a large measure of political liberty. And so if you rank countries around the world where people are better off, they're the countries where there's a large measure of economic liberty. And also, when there's a large measure of economic liberty, there's other kinds of liberty. That is, in terms of, if you look at the rankings of international Amnesty International, or the Freedom House, those countries with a lot of economic liberty, they have a whole lot of personal liberty as well.
Do you think it's possible that you're simply projecting a Western viewpoint on a very Middle Eastern country where these concepts of liberty just are not part of, their day-to-day operations the way it might be for you and me?
If it's not a part of the day-to-day operation, well, just let them be poor. I mean, that is, if you want to have there's not a lot of respect for personal liberty in the Middle East. And matter of fact, in most places of the world, and there wasn't respect for personal liberty in the West either. And I mean, the Western nations in Europe, they were barbarians, but we had the Magna Carta emerge in 1215, and the philosophers such as John Locke, Hume, Goethe, Humboldt, et cetera, that preached personal liberty. But you don't have this kind of a cultural movement away from barbarianism in many places of the world. And where the people are most barbaric, they're also the poorest and least free.
And is it possible or realistic for the United States to try, I mean, the nice way to say it is to try and teach these values, but as the other countries would say, to be imperialistic and enforce some of these Western values?
Well, no. I think that people have to emerge, on their own. I think that the worst thing that the United States can do for people around the world is to interfere with the way that they do things. I think the best that we can do to help our fellow man around the world, is to have economic freedom in our own country and have free trade.
Okay, I think we'll have to leave it with that bit of wisdom. We've been talking to Professor Walter Williams, who is a repeat customer on the Goldstein on Gelt show. Professor, in the last few seconds, just tell me, how can people best follow your work?
Oh, I think, I have a website, and it's walterewilliams.com, walterewilliams.com, and I have a number of my publications and books and And a lot of educational material there. Once again, it's walterewilliams.com.
All right. Thanks again for your time.
Okay. Bye.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.